the furry dog with the red collar easily caught the big. If you remember sentence diagramming from English class, this type of tree or this diagram tree is already a kind of interesting sentence structure because it placed the noun and the verb and the subject together in a structure with its modifiers. It's already an interesting way of visually conveying these relationships. And so when we start to think about spaces, like public spaces, private spaces, we start to see that diagram there of a typical house. It takes on some of the similar structure of relationships and connections and even graphic hierarchy. When we talk about graphic hierarchy, what's the first thing your eye goes to in that bubble diagram there? So the living room takes a certain precedent or prescience over the other subspaces, and we can start to see key relationships between these spaces and the private spaces of the house that perhaps in terms of how this house is oriented to the street or oriented to its arrival point, there's a graphic hierarchy that leans towards the living room itself. When we get into more complex systems, Paul would use diagramming methods to start to convey the sometimes difficult ways that people would circulate through spaces. This is a medical care facility, hospital of some kind. And he would use diagramming to help map out the possible conflicts, which in a hospital, there's a lot of conflict in terms of circulation, and patients can't mix with this and orderlies can't mix with this. There's a lot of different really complex operations that go into how people circulate through something like a hospital or an airport, where some people cannot mix with others pre-checkpoint, post-security checkpoint. Diagramming starts to help convey these complex relationships against each other. This is Paul's own house. It's about 4 blocks that way. He lives in the neighborhood. It's interesting how he starts with very simple bubble diagrams to illustrate the relationships of spaces, and then starts to bring in orientation to the street, orientation to cardinal directions, orientation to the sun, and starts to break up a public and private zone to the house itself. And it's those relationships that helped him later on get a little bit more grid oriented. You can see how the house is laid out on a grid, maybe a structural grid, maybe a spatial grid. Using this type of diagramming technique, which is still a bubble, but it's something a little bit more kind of like a boxy bubble, and with shade and tone and hatch and arrows and things of that nature, starts to illustrate the relationships of the house as one circulates through it. Later on, as he flips back into architectural drawing methods, you can still see the relationships between this hand-drawn floor plan and the sort of the bubble diagram, how things start to flow together. That is his house. I've been there. It has this particular layout on the first floor, an orientation to the street, an orientation to a backyard. So it's this type of graphic language that we'll start to use next week and practice next week for a good diagramming method that will help you convey some complex relationships to others. Graphic emphasis, we use different line types, different line weights, and again, different line types, dots, dashes, and the like, both for our hand methods and for computer. So we'll go into the stroke menu into Adobe Illustrator and start to continue to convey some different graphic types. We often use, in black and white drawings, we often use different tones or hatches to illustrate those relationships. So just with that variation of line weight, line type, and tone, we can start to show emphasis and start to map out things geographically. That goes for both hand and for illustrated methods. This, by the way, is the quad right here. This is Cap looking south. So a lot of the diagrams he did for his books were actually here. So you can start to pick apart that, oh yeah, that's Cap, there's Neely, there's business building. And then other site orientation diagrams, when we're starting to communicate specific aspects of a site, whether it be tree cover or relationship to a road or to a river or to the sun, we'll use diagramming methods and what we typically call site analysis diagram to help map out key views, winter wind, summer wind, the arc or axis of the sun, so we can help communicate to the client the optimal placing of a building or placing or clusters of buildings, or how the site might operate with relative to the sun. A lot of folks don't know that if you turn a building 45 degrees to the east-west and you corner it so that it's 45 degrees from parallel, that you get light in most of your spaces twice a day from east to west. Something Frank Lloyd Wright used to do. He would lay out the T-square, grab a 45-degree triangle, and orient the building so that the corner was facing south as opposed to one of the sides. And that way light would enter the house or the building twice a day. So just siting a building relative to the sun can make a huge difference in the quality of that entire development spaces later on. So site analysis is important to convey to the client, because the decisions that you're making about the development might have implications for orientations to views, the sun, or even good wind. This book is out of print. Actually, it's still on-demand printing. The new publishing environment we're living in is that some authors can't get large distribution, but they can still publish their books on demand. And Ed White wrote this book, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's still influential to us because it's these diagrams that help illustrate how a development might perform in sun or wind or sit on a site. And some of his graphic symbols and arrows and shapes and tones are things we still use today. They're quick ways to convey specific information in a notebook that help illustrate to the client, you have this, if you do this, this will happen. You have trees on this side, they will help block the wind. Let's put the development around those, not tear them all down, etc. So it's diagrams that help accompany our analytical judgment. An urban planner's greatest tool is your analytical judgment. Your greatest asset and greatest gift to the public is your analytical judgment. To convey your analytical judgment, we often use diagrams, which are visual form, to communicate that analytical judgment beyond words. Okay. And then more examples of those looser diagrams. Many of these are done ink line on paper, but we have adopted a lot of these same graphic types for Adobe Illustrator as we build up diagrams on top of geographic information or on site information. So very influential book. See all these different line types over here. Very influential book for architects, landscape architects, urban planners for 3 or 4 generations of folks. And then the diagrams get more specific to site location or site orientation. So a lot of information that we can communicate to the client regarding some of the best decisions that do have to be made in terms of how we site buildings or how we develop the site in further considerations. Other books, Landscape Graphics is one that we pull from. This is one of the gold standards for our friends in landscape architecture. Some of the diagramming methods are quite similar, so variations of graphic weight or graphic line hierarchy, as well as line type. Arrows that start to convey topography or emphasis or meandering. So we'll practice some of those things next week. Starting to build up symbols, shapes and symbols, using the markers and using the different felt tip pens. We'll practice some of that next week. All the way into conceptual layouts for sites that might incorporate circulation or even edges. How we move through space, how we move through a district, how we move through a city, how we start to lay out a site. Other folks, one of my favorite firms from London, Rogers, Sturt, Harbour and Partners. This is on the edge of Hyde Park. One of the more expensive developments they ever did, but I think just in the culture of the firm, even though you're talking about $1 billion development of high-end housing on the edge of Hyde Park, not far from Buckingham, this firm still uses diagrams to convey some of the decisions that they had to make regarding solar orientation and views into the park. And then other examples of how all these other symbols, the smiley sun might be a little bit too comical for some folks, but maybe some clients like it and communicates to them. And then I teach a charrette graphics elective in the spring that starts to just focus on those hand methods and starts to look at diagramming and representation of people and places and trees and things of that nature just with hand methods. So this is one exercise from that particular elective, but it has a way of illustrating a concept for a highway exit that might model a lot of the decisions that we'll be making as planners in the future. Graphic diagramming and information is an abstract method. It's the Latin word abstractus means to draw out or pull out. And when you abstract something, you're pulling away one layer of information and communicating in a manner that people can understand. The Harry Beck London transport map from 1933 is a wonderful example of that because it started to completely change the way we looked at transit mapping. We can understand how both origin and destination. So a lot's been said about Harry and about the history of how this map came to be, but it was this map that started to influence all transit mapping across the world of how one starts to read both origin and destination. And he oversimplified the complexity of the system and oversimplified the complexity of the London geography. The river doesn't look like that, but he simplifies the river so that the graphic system of how the information is conveyed is more readable. And so that was the gold standard. Here's how it looks today. The difference between the gray and the white is illustrating the different zones, and that's how the different fare structure is analyzed. So if you're going from zone 4 to zone 1, you pay a higher fare than if you're just traveling in between zone 1. It's still very, very oversimplified. Look at the river. The river doesn't do that. But it's important to know when you're reading the system where you are in relationship to the river, because the Thames has such a way of orienting the city. But again, it's important to remember that the city doesn't look like that. It doesn't look this simple. It is illustrated this way to understand how the lines converge into the city, and so that we can read the labels and the names of the stations. If we were to read London as if it were geographically correct, it would look like a plate of spaghetti. And it would be virtually unreadable unless you're, really familiar with London. And so there have been graphic attempts to say, let's do a transit map that's more accurate to what's happening geographically. Look at the river, it's much more natural. And you can see, wow, how all these different lines converge into the central city. Zoom out and it's wow. But that is a more geographically appropriate version of London than what the transit system map actually does. New York, the current MTA map has been patterned after a map that was developed in 1972. It's been revitalized and rethought. Every year, transit mapping nerds rethink this map every year on Reddit and on social media, many different versions of that. But this is the map we know in terms of how we navigate, or how I navigate, either arriving at Kennedy or LaGuardia and then migrating into Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, and Manhattan. This is a radical revisitation of that. Max Roberts is a graphic designer from Chicago who's made a proposal to rethink the system map, to take a radial concept and show stations radiated from the center. Geographically, that point is probably Lady Liberty, or very close to Liberty Island, but it is a way of conveying the information in a more readable fashion, illustrating how folks actually move through the system. They typically move in and out to Lower Manhattan every day, at least before COVID. Okay, and so why not convey the system as if it were radiating from that center, as opposed to a quasi-geographic representation? And this has gained some ground on social media. This artist, a Mauryan mapping artist, took some photographs or panoramas, and then started to lay the system over the aerial to convey the complexity of the system. And again, if we were to try to read this map, it would be very different than the system map that we use. But this artist has done several pieces illustrating the subway system overlaid onto the aerial, and it's a different way of looking at the city, a different way of looking at the system versus this simplified version. Other graphic artists, Rem Koolhaas is known as a Dutch architect primarily. They do deal with suburban design planning projects. Working with graphic designer Bruce Mao, back before COVID, and before I think the internet really took over media in hypermedia, they would illustrate a book once a year or every 2 years that really started to illustrate and map some really complex issues in society. And so some fascinating diagrams from that series of books from Rem Koolhaas and Bruce Mao. Sometimes it's not just what the map is saying, but how the map is grouped or how it's paired. Page, okay. When you start to look at the relationships between, just the power of how these maps are grouped starts to illustrate some more complex thinking. And so what is the relationship between suicide and repression? Or what is the relationship between number of prisoners and illiteracy? What is the relationship between quality, I believe that's quality of life, or quality control, International Standards Organization guidelines for products, okay, and GDP. So that in itself is a pretty powerful message of how you group different layers of information together. And I think this military expenditure per capita, that's something we all have to rethink, perhaps in the next election and the next election cycle. We started mapping out trade, commercial exchange and trade. Again, pre-COVID, post-COVID, pre-Brexit, post-Brexit. The Brexit debate, I think, is more interesting and more easy to understand if you understand that the European Union is its own #1 trading partner. And once you understand that, and Brexit starts to take on a different animal in terms of where is Britain going to get their food from in the next year? These are real issues. Once you understand that the European Union doesn't typically trade outside of itself. So those are some key issues as folks filling their prescriptions and finding green peppers in Britain are going to be finding in the next year. I think it's Domino's Britain has stockpiled frozen vegetables enough to fill pizza orders post-Brexit. But we use diagramming methods to do that. We might use sizes or shape size to illustrate density. We might, again, use line type or line weight to illustrate a stronger relationship versus a weaker relationship. The graphic language is the same as what Paul gave us 30 years ago in his book, but the graphic tools are different because we can do all this in Illustrator now. And then what we typically call a heat map, classification of a heat map, one more intense color versus a less intense color illustrates hierarchy and relationships as well, relative to these geographic notions. So number of cellular phones, number of computers, researchers in R&D, and then students. And you can see the geopolitical situation is changing, rapidly changing based on all of this information. Another magazine that before Anybody remembers magazines? Any of y'all remember magazines? They were web pages on paper. They were great. They were like web pages on paper. All right. Good Magazine was one of my favorites. It used to be able to get this at Starbucks, every Starbucks. It's still around online, of course. It's not printed anymore. But their graphics department was incredible. I think rivaled the graphics department at USA Today, just for how the inventiveness of how they would group information. Mapping distribution of income by religious belief. And so looking at different religious groups and then income from less than $20,000 all the way to $100,000. And we can see graphic intensities in a couple of the different groups here versus others. So the graph is using an ordering system of a radial system. It's using pictorial representation of worship facilities, which there are some architectural implications and conventions that are associated with those religions. And then using color intensity from light to shade to convey greater wealth or less wealth. So using color, using an ordering system, using pictorials, and then using that graphic hierarchy to convey that system. This one hit me. You know how some graphs or infographics really hit you and you go, I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that. The amount of water that it takes to produce beef is astounding compared to even other animal proteins. And a graph like this can really start to convey how many gallons of water it takes to produce that. And then we think about our meat consumption relative to the amount of fresh water we have, the amount of fresh water we're going to have, given our climate change situation. This will become a political issue, or it is becoming a political issue in terms of this party wants to take away your cheeseburgers. Okay. But it's not that they don't like cheeseburgers. Lots of people like cheeseburgers. It's the implications on the climate and on farming and on water, and what it takes to produce that beef. And what is happening in rainforest climates surrounding the demand for it. So a graph like this can be very powerful because it can, for me, it started to change my way of thinking and change the way I started to eat. Other things, this is a fascinating one. Who's coming to America using different color and different hierarchies, but it's patterned off of the US flag. This would be a very different diagram if it didn't have the image of the flag as its basis, right? It would be a very different flag. So very powerful. Again, a powerful image based on an abstraction of the US flag that really jumps off the page. And using shadow and color intensity and color contrast, this 80% gray, again, this would be a very different diagram if it were on a white background. But there's something about that 80% gray and the 60% gray that makes the colors really pop. How to curl. Every 4 years, Americans invade Twitter with the question of what the hell is curling? Because the Winter Olympics has it, and because the curling games are so long that typically there is curling on almost 24 hours a day during the Winter Olympics. So simple diagram that starts to illustrate the game, the origins of the game, and the terminology of the game. But yeah, every 4 years, there's lots of questions on Twitter as to what the hell am I looking at? Kevin Lynch is an author, urban planner, and urban designer that wrote a book called Image of the City in 1961. He argued that city imageability, that was the word he used, imageability, is the way to read a city versus other cities. To be able to read one city versus another could be illustrated just through these particular elements: paths, edges, district nodes, landmarks. That if you started to map that out, you could read one city versus another. He used a simple diagramming method in the 1960s. Interesting, they used the Star of David for landmark versus the triangle, but he used these additional tones and lines to do that and started to create a mapping language that he could use to read one city from another. He and his students would use interviews as their primary conveyance. So this is more of an anthropological method of interviewing and people's feedback. So that's LA, downtown LA, I should say. Smaller downtown than others, but a noticeable one. These are some of the diagrams that he and his students started to make as they were mapping those particular elements against the geographic complexity of the city itself. So by just drawing away or pulling away layers of information, you're starting to be able to read them against everything else. There are some civic spaces in LA, Grand Park, City Hall, that are noticeable landmarks. That's the Chandler Pavilion, Disney Concert Hall is just next to it. And it's on axis with other government centers. So mapping that, it starts to map. Grand Park starts to become an element in the diagram. Here's City Hall here, lined up with Civic Center and the courthouse. So he and his students were starting to make these maps not based on, based on geographic information, but where people would identify as a landmark or as where they would hang out or they wouldn't hang out. And then started in the 60s, started mapping out the different ethnocentric areas of LA as they started to identify around food and around culture and even around religious services and things like that. It's this type of method that had a great influence on us as planners as we started to diagram cities and districts and neighborhoods against each other. Again, we don't use the same symbols anymore, but the method of graphic intensity, shade or tone or color or line type or line weight is something we still use when we make our diagrams. So very influential to us. Now, Google is starting to do some interesting things with their mapping. They're starting to convey the gray as the typical urban city grid. They're starting to use this tan color in every mapping application for every city to indicate this is a collection of interesting places, interesting things. And so already, just with that color difference, it's starting to convey that there might be a concentration of retail, concentration of restaurants, concentration of culture. They're noticing that through their mapping interface, there might be something interesting happening. Now, how do they do that? They do it through the intensity of check-ins to their places directory, and Android users, they also track speed and location of Android phones, concentration of Android phones. That's how Google is able to convey their traffic intensity, because they're actually tracking all of the Android phones out there. So that is how they start to put those things together. Yeah, it makes you think, wait a minute, they're tracking? Yeah, they are. The places directory, which is every check-in, every address business, is mapped onto their interface. And that, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, is what Pokemon uses. They use the Google Places directory to create their maps. Their gyms, their, what do they call, face marks or landmarks? Yeah. So they actually use that directory to start to create the game. And so that's why, as I said on our walk 2 weeks ago, that's why there were 300 people in downtown Muncie, because there was a concentration of historic buildings, restaurants, and landmarks, National Register buildings. That's what created all the intensity around that game. And so those are mapped. If we look at the different layers, Professor Yu is going to be installing Google Earth Pro on the computers tomorrow for us. So thank her again. Thank Professor Yu. So we'll be able to start to map and look at those buildings against these different marks. The Google Earth Pro has some wonderful 3D imagery that we can fly over different cities. Not all cities, but larger cities, including Muncie and Indianapolis. So we'll be able to look at cities in a new way shortly with Google Earth. Another district that they mapped was called Beacon Hill, a very wealthy neighborhood right next to Boston Common and the Government Center. One of the more visited parts of Boston, great collection of row houses and businesses, and some great historic fabric as well. So he and his students would start to look at the figure ground, building versus non-building, or mass versus void. That's a diagramming method we often use. But also they got into what do residents call the sub-districts in the neighborhood? What is the anthropological or cultural name for one sub-district for another? And then they started mapping things that other folks wouldn't map. Institutional uses versus antique shop. Look at all the antique shops on Charles Street. And that's where you'll notice in the Midwest, we often adapt or adopt street names from other cities. My hometown in Michigan has a Broadway, for instance. It's not like Broadway in New York, but it's still called Broadway because of the influence of a lot of the cities on the eastern seaboard. This is an interesting map. It's topography plus steep streets. Interesting grouping, but sorry? Steep streets, yeah. They mapped that relationship because it was an interesting grouping, because you look at the neighborhood like that, you would assume it's all flat, and it's not flat. It's called Beacon Hill because it's a hill, and once you start to map those two things against each other, you realize as you're walking up these streets, you're like, oh, that there might be a relationship between those steep streets and the topography itself, because the other maps make it look flat, and it's not flat. Yeah. Oh yes, yes. In 61, 62, when they were doing this, they had some satellite photography. Some. CIA had it, because we were U-2 spy planes and stuff like that. There was the beginning of early, not satellite, but aerial photography of cities and maps. Or they would take an existing map that the cartographer had made of the neighborhood and then overlay it. So they were already starting to trace information off of existing cartographic maps of the neighborhood. But it was a time of early aerial photography. We know that from the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that. The higher resolution films were starting to happen. And then you may know the story of Gary Powers, who was a U-2 spy plane pilot that was shot down over the Soviet Union, and then getting him back. And that was a whole thing. But Kevin Lynch and his students were mapping. I think the big point here is that they were mapping things that most folks probably weren't interested in, but they were curious about inset doorways and brick sidewalks. So they started mapping that. And they saw that starts to give the character of the neighborhood. Or what's the other one? Bay windows and ornamental ironwork. So that concentration starts to tell you something about that neighborhood that's interesting about it. At least to us, right? Urban planners, urban designers, historic preservationists, architects, landscape architects. So we use the same methods. This is pre-Luke. That white pillow thing is the RCA dome. Most Hoosiers know it as the Hoosier Dome, and still call it the Hoosier Dome. They should. John Mellencamp did a sold-out show there. U2 played there, and that was the original home of the 1984 post-Baltimore Colts. Those of us who were born in Maryland do not forget that they were the Baltimore Colts. But that's a long story. We did a charrette in 2000 as the Central City Regional Center plan started to come together. about this entire south side. The remarkable devastation, tear down, disinvestment in the neighborhood south of Union Station. So we were very interested in that future, so we started to map it, and we used those elements: paths, edges, districts, landmarks, and nodes, isolating those groups of elements from the map to help us understand them better. And so we used a graphic method to do that. The impact of the highway, wow. I mean, if you look at an aerial of this part of Indianapolis in 1940, it is a dense, thriving urban neighborhood. And it wasn't that in 2000. It's still recovering today. But it's because of the highway, the impact of the highway. We back up here. Back up, Lauren. The figure ground is quite impactful because it helped us understand that bigger building footprints were indicative of the industrial heritage of this side of the White River. And these were all factories. Diamond Chain Factory is a historic factory. Much of this has been wiped away because Lynch is now taking up all of this. And then the historic neighborhoods, the Great Shapiro's delicatessen, which almost is on this side. This was a Jewish neighborhood in the middle century. So there's still remnants of those buildings, those synagogues, houses of worship. The Lilly campus coming in, the Lilly building here, and then dominating this whole area for about 30 years. And then erecting fences to prevent protesters from entering the campus because Lilly does animal testing and attracted protesters. So that enclosed campus field, and then the remnants of Fletcher Place and Fountain Square that were completely bisected by the highways. So the urban fabric of Virginia Avenue, as it comes from downtown, radiates down toward Fountain Square. My favorite downtown neighborhood. The highway completely bifurcating that urban fabric and changing it forever. It's still recovering 50 years later. So, yes, so the highway has an impact, it still has an impact, particularly if you have something like asthma. It has an impact today. So those were some of the things we started to study. And what the diagramming method was helped us frame our minds in terms of what the issues were about the future of the neighborhood, was really how to deal or impact around the impact of that highway. We can do it in PowerPoint. You can do much of this in PowerPoint, just with the tools in PowerPoint. It's amazing. So if you find yourself in a professional situation where you don't have the Adobe suite, there's still quite a lot you can do with PowerPoint. By hand, these are the same methods. So this is me using those graphic methods to start to convey some information, using the same symbols, the same tones, the same line types. And then next week, I'll teach you how to do it in Illustrator, starting to look at a general concept or study area, start to map out landmarks and nodes and lines. This is a study we did for Anderson. The city of Anderson has been investigating the idea of building a lake, a reservoir. That reservoir, if built using the existing topography of Anderson, would flood all of this, would touch the ancient mounds, probably get rid of the airport. But they felt for years that building a new reservoir in Anderson would save it, because it would create opportunities for recreation, high-end real estate. It's an expensive thing. It would be billions of dollars. There are arguments pro and against whether or not we need the water. But the sheer amount of real estate that would be flooded by it is astounding. And so the Hoosier Environmental Council hired us to say, look, this is not the right thing to do. We need to propose an alternative. And that's what the Mounds Greenway project was in response to. It was to say, if we can develop the White River corridor as a biped greenway, you have the recreational opportunities, and we can preserve the wildlife and anthropological heritage that's along that river. The idea of flooding an ancient burial mound should be controversial. So we started to map out the alternatives that a greenway project would do to help activate Anderson and connect them to us. We could ride a bike from Muncie Yorktown to Anderson, and then eventually to Noblesville, and then connect with the Monon and the Nipple Point. So there could be a bicycle connection from Muncie all the way into Indianapolis by knitting these greenways together. So this mapping method is what I'll teach you next week. Nodes, paths, edges, districts, using these different colors and line types, line weights, arrows. I'll get more into that next week. Okay. Zoning is not the same as land use. It's not the same thing. Much of your study area, if you're looking at any portion of downtown, is all zone mixed use. It's zone central business, sorry. It's zone CBD, central business district. All of this has zoning classification that makes it different than anything beside it. So we often confuse zoning and land use because maybe they use some of the same colors. Okay, but it's important that they're not the same thing. And also important to remember, not all communities are zoned. Zoning is a post-World War II idea, and they're a very Midwestern idea. You can go to communities in Pennsylvania that are not zoned because they don't believe it. They consider it an infringement on land rights. And in Pennsylvania, they will tell you that their great-great-great-great-grandfather fought a war against people who told them what to do with their land. So, and zoning is actually part of that. So it's been a great joy to work in Pennsylvania and work with those folks. Land use is commonly distributed in a color system that allows all planners, cartographers, public officials to distinguish one from another. And we use color type and color intensity to convey the intensity of the use. High industrial versus light. High foot traffic retail versus light foot traffic commercial. High density living versus low density. So that is a land use color system that we use to convey both the land uses and the intensity of that land use. Special use is the most confusing one, but that's every non-taxable building, church, library, city hall, jail, university building, non-taxed, institutional is all conveyed under special use. So if we were starting to do a land use inventory of downtown, we would start to see something like this. The dark gray is on purpose. It's the surface parking. All of that surface parking. So the diagrammatic method starts to communicate that very quickly. By hand, it looks something like this. It's a combination of bubbles, and arrows and labels. Another one. And what this does, because the zoning map doesn't tell you this, it starts to tell you as an emerging planner, these are the things happening in my corner of my study area. So these are the things I have to be sensitive to, either a concentration of special use or a concentration of residential, concentration of retail. These are the things that future development needs to be considered of. Needs to consider. And then in Google Earth Pro, we can even get a 3/4 view from the bird's eye view and start to diagram over that. And that's really fun, really fun. Okay, so that's what we'll do next week. So that will be fun, I think, I hope. So more on that next week.